Mike Tyson saves kidnapped child left tied in alley. Crowd astonished. The narrow alley was cloaked in shadows, its grimy walls and scattered debris creating an atmosphere of unease. The dim flicker of a distant street lamp barely reached the area, leaving most of it shrouded in darkness. The faint sound of dripping water echoed in the silence, punctuated only by the occasional shuffle of a rat scurrying across the trash-strewn ground. It was the kind of place where secrets were hidden, where things happened that people didn't talk about. Two figures stood at the center of the alley, their movements hurried and tense. One was a tall, broad-shouldered man wearing a dark hoodie, his face obscured by the shadow of his hood. His hands moved deftly, securing thick ropes around the torso of a struggling child. The boy, no older than 6 or 7, twisted and squirmed, his muffled cries barely audible through the gag tied tightly around his mouth. "Hold him still," the man growled, his voice low and harsh as he tightened the knots. The second figure, a shorter man wearing a surgical mask, grunted in frustration as he grabbed the boy's flailing legs. "I'm trying," the masked man snapped, his voice muffled but sharp. "The kid won't stop moving. Just hurry up and finish this before someone sees us." The boy let out a muffled whimper, his wide eyes darting around the alley as tears streamed down his face. His small hands clawed at the ropes binding him, but it was no use. The men were too strong, their grips unyielding. "You said this place was deserted," the hooded man muttered, his tone accusatory. He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the darkened alley with paranoia. "What if someone comes?" "No one's coming," the masked man replied, his tone impatient. "We picked this spot for a reason. Now stop worrying and get it done." The hooded man hesitated for a moment, his hands hovering over the final knot. His gaze flicked to the boy's tear-streaked face, and something in his expression wavered. This feels wrong," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "He's just a kid." The masked man froze, his head snapping toward his accomplice. "Don't go soft on me now," he hissed, his tone venomous. "We've already come this far. You want to back out and leave me to clean up the mess? Is that it?" The hooded man flinched, his shoulders tensing. "No, I didn't think it'd be like this. I thought..." "You thought what?" The masked man interrupted, his voice rising with anger. "That this would be easy? That we'd just grab him and walk away? Grow up. This is how things are done." The boy whimpered again, his muffled cries tugging at the edges of the hooded man's conscience. He looked down at his hands, which were trembling slightly, and then back at the boy. "I don't know, man," he said, his voice uncertain. "Maybe we should..." A sharp sound interrupted him, a faint but unmistakable shuffle of footsteps coming from the far end of the alley. Both men froze, their heads snapping toward the noise. The hooded man's heart raced as his grip on the rope tightened instinctively. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The masked man didn't respond immediately. His eyes narrowed as he stared into the darkness, his body tense and motionless. After a moment, he shook his head. "It's nothing," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. "Probably just a rat. Maybe we should go," the hooded man said, his voice rising slightly. He gestured toward the boy. "Leave him here and..." "We're not leaving," the masked man snapped, cutting him off. "We finish what we started." The footsteps grew louder, echoing through the alley with a slow, deliberate rhythm. The sound was steady, unhurried, and carried an air of confidence that sent a chill down the hooded man's spine. "Someone's coming," he hissed, his voice rising. "We need to go now." The masked man glared at him, his eyes blazing with frustration. "If you want to run, go ahead," he said coldly. "But I'm not leaving until this is done." The hooded man hesitated, his gaze darting between the approaching footsteps and the boy tied up on the ground. His breathing quickened, his hands trembling as the weight of the situation pressed down on him. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and the alley fell into an eerie silence. Both men held their breath, their eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. A moment later, a low, gravelly voice cut through the silence, its tone calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. "Looks like you boys picked the wrong alley." The hooded man's blood ran cold, his eyes widening as he turned toward the source of the voice. In the dim light, a figure emerged from the shadows. A broad-shouldered man with a bald head and a presence that radiated raw power. His face was calm, almost casual, but his eyes burned with a fierce intensity that made it clear he wasn't here to negotiate. "Who the hell are you?" the masked man demanded, his voice shaking slightly despite his attempt at bravado. The man didn't answer immediately. He stepped closer, his movements deliberate and unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world. The faint light from the street lamp illuminated his face, and the hooded man's stomach dropped as recognition set in. That's Mike Tyson," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The masked man stiffened, his eyes narrowing as he stared at the approaching figure. "You're joking," he said, though his tone betrayed his doubt. "There's no way," I said. Tyson interrupted, his voice low and steady. "You picked the wrong alley." The hooded man took a shaky step back, his hands trembling as he released his grip on the rope. "We need to go," he whispered urgently, his gaze darting toward the masked man. "Now?" But the masked man wasn't ready to back down. His body tensed, his hands curling into fists as he stepped forward. "I don't care who you are," he said, his voice rising with false confidence. "This has nothing to do with you. Walk away." Tyson's expression didn't change. He took another step forward, his presence filling the alley like a storm cloud. "That kid," he said, nodding toward the boy, "has everything to do with me." The hooded man's breathing quickened, his heart pounding in his chest as he took another step back. The masked man, however, stood his ground, his fists tightening as he prepared for a confrontation he wasn't ready for. The air in the alley grew heavier, the tension crackling like electricity as the standoff began. The masked man stepped forward, the dim light from the distant street lamp casting an eerie glow over his face. His eyes were hard, defiant, though a flicker of uncertainty lingered beneath the bravado. His hand instinctively reached for the knife strapped to his belt, fingers brushing the worn leather handle. "I'm not scared of you," he spat, his voice sharp and brittle. "You're just some washed-up fighter looking for trouble." Behind him, the hooded man took another step back, his hands raised slightly as if to show he wanted no part of what was about to happen. His breathing was shallow, his gaze darting between Tyson and his accomplice. "Let's just leave," he muttered, his voice trembling. "This isn't worth it." But the masked man ignored him, his focus locked on Tyson. The child, still bound and gagged, whimpered softly, his wide eyes darting between the men as tears continued to stream down his face. His small body twisted against the ropes, but the knots held firm, leaving him helpless in the face of the escalating standoff. Tyson's expression remained calm, his broad shoulders relaxed as he took another slow, deliberate step forward. His presence was unshakable, his movements measured and unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world. "You think I'm looking for trouble?" he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Nah, trouble found me, and it looks like it found you too." The masked man's grip tightened on the knife handle, his knuckles turning white. "You don't scare me," he snarled, though his voice wavered ever so slightly. He glanced at the hooded man, his frustration boiling over. "Do something," he barked. "Don't just stand there." The hooded man hesitated, his feet frozen in place as his instincts screamed at him to run. I didn't sign up for this," he stammered, his voice barely audible. "This wasn't part of the plan." Tyson's gaze flicked to the hooded man, his sharp eyes narrowing. "You think you're innocent just because you're scared now?" he said, his tone cutting through the tension like a knife. "You tied up a kid. You don't get to back out now like it's someone else's problem." The hooded man flinched as though Tyson's words had struck him physically. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Instead, he took another step back, his hands trembling as he looked toward the alley's exit. "Don't you dare run," the masked man growled, his tone venomous. He turned his attention back to Tyson, his body tensing like a spring coiled too tightly. "You think you're some kind of hero?" he said, his voice rising. This isn't a boxing ring. You step out of line and you'll regret it." Tyson tilted his head slightly, his lips curling into the faintest hint of a smile. It wasn't a smile of amusement. It was the kind of smile that promised consequences. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, his tone almost conversational. "I'm not here to fight you. I'm here to stop you." The masked man's patience snapped. With a guttural yell, he drew the knife from his belt, the blade catching the dim light as he brandished it in front of him. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice cracking as his desperation began to seep through the cracks in his facade. "I'm warning you." Tyson didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. Instead, he took another step forward, his calm demeanor only fueling the masked man's growing panic. "You think that knife makes you dangerous?" Tyson said, his voice steady. "All it does is make you stupid." "Shut up," the masked man screamed, his grip tightening on the blade. He glanced over his shoulder at the hooded man, who was now several steps closer to the alley's exit. "Get over here," he shouted. "I'm not doing this alone." But the hooded man didn't move. His eyes were wide, his breathing shallow as he stared at Tyson like a deer caught in headlights. "I can't," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm not doing this anymore." The masked man's frustration boiled over, his face contorting with rage. "Coward," he spat, turning his full attention back to Tyson. "You want to be the big man, huh? You think you can just walk in here and scare us off? Let's see how tough you really are." He lunged forward, the knife flashing as he swung it toward Tyson. The movement was wild, desperate, the kind of strike that came from fear rather than skill. Tyson sidestepped easily, his movements smooth and controlled, and the blade sliced through empty air. The masked man stumbled, his momentum carrying him forward, and Tyson didn't miss the opportunity. He stepped closer, his presence looming as he spoke in a voice low enough that only the masked man could hear. "You've got one chance to walk away," he said, his tone calm but carrying a weight that made it clear he wasn't making an idle threat. "Take it." But the masked man wasn't listening. His pride, his fear, and his anger had taken over, clouding his judgment and driving him to lash out again. He swung the knife in a wide arc, his movements frantic and uncontrolled, and Tyson stepped back just far enough to let the blade miss him by inches. The hooded man watched in stunned silence, his back pressed against the wall near the alley's exit. He looked down at his hands, which were still trembling, and then at the child tied up on the ground. The boy's eyes met his, wide and filled with terror, and something inside the hooded man broke. "I can't do this," he muttered, his voice trembling. He turned toward the exit, his feet moving as though of their own accord. "I'm out. I'm done. Don't you dare," the masked man shouted, his voice rising with fury as he glanced over his shoulder. "If you leave now." But the hooded man didn't stop. He bolted for the alley's exit, his footsteps echoing in the narrow space as he disappeared into the night. The masked man's rage boiled over, and he turned back to Tyson, his face twisted with anger. "This is your fault," he screamed, his voice raw. "You think you can just walk in here and ruin everything?" Tyson didn't respond. He stood his ground, his expression calm but his eyes blazing with intensity as he watched the masked man unravel in front of him. The knife wavered in the man's hand, his grip faltering as the weight of the situation pressed down on him. And then, without warning, the masked man lunged again, his movements desperate and erratic as he swung the blade toward Tyson one last time. The masked man's lunge was wild and reckless, his desperation overtaking any sense of strategy or precision. The knife flashed in the dim light, the blade slicing through the air toward Tyson with enough force to show he was going for blood. But Tyson's movements were swift and measured, honed through years of instinct and training. He sidestepped the attack with ease, his feet barely making a sound against the damp concrete. The masked man stumbled forward, his momentum carrying him too far as the blade missed its mark. He let out a frustrated growl, his breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps as he whipped around to face Tyson again. His grip on the knife was unsteady now, his hands slick with sweat, but the fire in his eyes burned hotter than ever. He wasn't gonna back down, not yet. You think you're some kind of god? Huh? The masked man spat, his voice trembling with a mix of rage and fear. Just because you're Mike Tyson, you think you can walk in here and scare me? I'm not afraid of you. Tyson didn't respond immediately. He stood still, his broad shoulders relaxed and his hands at his sides, as if the man in front of him posed no threat at all. His eyes, however, told a different story. They were locked onto the masked man, sharp and unyielding, reading every twitch, every shift in his stance. Tyson wasn't just watching, he was calculating. You should be afraid, Tyson said finally, his voice low and deliberate. Not of me, but of what you're doing. That kid didn't do anything to deserve this, and you know it. The masked man flinched at Tyson's words, but he quickly masked it with a sneer. Shut up, he snapped, his voice rising. You don't know anything about me. You don't know why I'm doing this. I don't need to know, Tyson replied, his tone calm but firm. I see what's in front of me, and what I see is a coward hiding behind a knife, picking on someone who can't fight back. The masked man let out a furious roar and lunged again, the knife aimed at Tyson's midsection. This time, his movements were faster, more deliberate, but Tyson was faster still. He stepped to the side, his hand shooting out to grab the masked man's wrist with a grip that was both precise and unrelenting. The knife clattered to the ground, its sharp edge glinting in the faint light as it bounced against the concrete. The masked man let out a gasp of pain, his knees buckling slightly as Tyson's iron grip twisted his wrist just enough to send a clear message. He was outmatched. But the masked man wasn't done yet. With a surge of adrenaline, he pulled back with all his strength, managing to free his arm from Tyson's grasp. He stumbled backward, his chest heaving as he glared at Tyson with a mixture of rage and desperation. His eyes darted toward the knife on the ground, and he lunged for it, his fingers outstretched. Before he could reach it, Tyson's foot shot out, kicking the knife across the alley and out of the masked man's reach. It skidded to a stop several feet away, coming to rest near the still-bound child. The boy flinched, his wide eyes darting between the knife and the men as tears continued to stream down his face. The masked man let out a string of curses, his hands balling into fists as he straightened up. You think you've won? He snarled, his voice cracking. This isn't over. Tyson's expression didn't waver. He took a slow step forward, his presence filling the narrow alley like a storm cloud. It's already over, he said simply. You just don't know it yet. The masked man's rage boiled over, and he charged at Tyson with his fists swinging wildly. His movements were sloppy and uncoordinated, driven more by anger than any real intent to harm. Tyson ducked and weaved effortlessly, his body moving with the grace of someone who had spent a lifetime in the ring. Each punch missed its mark, the masked man's frustration growing with every failed attempt. Stay still, the masked man shouted, his voice hoarse. He swung again, his fist cutting through the air with enough force to make a sharp whooshing sound. But Tyson leaned back just far enough to avoid the blow, his movements as smooth and controlled as ever. You're wasting your time, Tyson said, his tone almost bored. You're not gonna win this. Shut up, the masked man screamed, his face twisted with rage. He swung again, his fist aimed at Tyson's head. This time, Tyson caught the man's wrist mid-swing, his grip firm and unyielding. The masked man froze, his breath catching in his throat as he stared at Tyson with wide, panicked eyes. For the first time, the full weight of the situation seemed to hit him. Tyson wasn't just a man, he was a force of nature, and the masked man had no chance of overcoming him. You're done, Tyson said, his voice low but carrying an undeniable finality. The masked man tried to pull back, but Tyson held firm, his grip like a vice. The tension in the alley was palpable, the air thick with the weight of what was happening. The child whimpered again, his small body trembling as he watched the scene unfold. Before anyone could move, the faint sound of sirens reached the alley, growing louder with each passing second. The masked man's eyes widened, his panic reaching a fever pitch. No, he whispered, his voice trembling. No, no, no. Tyson glanced toward the alley's exit, where the distant flashing of red and blue lights was now visible. The cavalry was coming, but the situation wasn't over yet. Not until the masked man was subdued and the child was safe. The masked man's desperation took over, and he yanked his arm free from Tyson's grip with a burst of adrenaline-fueled strength. He stumbled backward, his gaze darting around the alley like a trapped animal searching for an escape. Tyson took a step forward, his eyes locked onto the masked man with an intensity that could cut through steel. "Don't even think about it," he said, his voice a low growl. But the masked man was already moving, his feet carrying him toward the child, who was still bound and helpless on the ground. Tyson's eyes narrowed, his body tensing like a coiled spring. He was close enough to intervene but held back for just a fraction of a second, watching the masked man's every move. Tyson knew the man was spiraling, his actions driven by sheer panic, and that made him more dangerous than ever. "Don't touch him," Tyson warned, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. There was no shouting, no unnecessary theatrics, just the kind of calm authority that made it clear he wasn't making a request. The masked man hesitated, his fingers hovering over the boy's bindings. He glanced back at Tyson, his face twisted with frustration and fear. "What are you gonna do?" "Huh?" He spat, his voice shaking. "You think you can stop me? You're just one guy." "I don't think," Tyson replied, taking a slow step forward. "I know." The masked man's eyes flicked toward the knife Tyson had kicked across the alley. It lay just out of reach, but the temptation was too much to resist. He dove for it, his hands scraping against the rough concrete as he grabbed the hilt. The knife felt heavier than before, the sweat on his palms making it slippery, but he held onto it like a lifeline. The child's muffled cries grew louder, his small body trembling as the masked man rose to his feet, the knife clutched tightly in his hand. "Stay back," the man shouted, his voice cracking. He raised the blade, pointing it at Tyson like a desperate animal cornered by a predator. "I swear, I'll do it." Tyson's face remained calm, his eyes locked onto the masked man with unrelenting focus. "You don't want to do this," he said, his voice low and steady. "You're not thinking straight. Put the knife down before you make things worse." "Worse?" The masked man barked out a bitter laugh, though it sounded more like a sob. "It's already worse. You ruined everything. This was supposed to be easy." "Easy?" Tyson's voice sharpened, his tone cutting through the masked man's panic like a scalpel. "You call tying up a kid easy? You think you're the victim here?" The masked man's grip on the knife faltered for a split second, his eyes darting toward the boy. The sight of the child, bound and crying, seemed to shake him, but the anger quickly returned. He shook his head violently, as if trying to erase the doubt creeping into his mind. "You don't understand," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "You don't know what it's like." "You're right," Tyson said, taking another step forward. "I don't know what it's like to be you, but I know what it's like to fight. And this isn't a fight. This is cowardice." The words hit the masked man like a slap. His face twisted with rage, and he raised the knife higher, his hand trembling. "Shut up," he screamed, his voice raw. "Just shut up." Tyson didn't flinch. He took another step closer, his movements deliberate and controlled. "You've got two choices," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You can walk away from this or you can keep digging your hole. But if you go down that second road, you won't like where it ends." The masked man's breathing grew heavier, his chest heaving as he struggled to process Tyson's words. The knife wavered in his hand, the blade catching the faint light as it shook. For a moment, it seemed like he might lower it. But then the sirens grew louder, the flashing red and blue lights spilling into the alley as a pair of police cars screeched to a halt at the entrance. The masked man froze, his eyes wide with panic as the reality of his situation hit him like a freight train. "No," he whispered, his voice trembling. "No, no, no." He took a step back, his movements frantic and uncoordinated as he glanced between Tyson and the approaching officers. "They can't take me. I'm not going to jail." The child whimpered again, his muffled cries drawing Tyson's attention for a split second. Tyson's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides as he prepared to act. He didn't need to look at the masked man to know what was about to happen. The man's panic boiled over, and with a guttural scream, he lunged forward, the knife aimed directly at Tyson's chest. It was a wild, desperate attack, the kind that came from someone who had already decided he had nothing left to lose. Tyson moved like lightning. His body shifted to the side, the blade missing him by inches as he grabbed the man's wrist with one hand and his shoulder with the other. The masked man struggled violently, but Tyson's grip was unrelenting, his strength undeniable. "Drop it," Tyson growled, his voice low and dangerous. The masked man thrashed against him, his movements frantic and chaotic, but Tyson held firm. "I said, drop it." The knife clattered to the ground, the sound echoing through the alley like a gunshot. The masked man let out a strangled cry, his knees buckling as Tyson twisted his arm just enough to force him to the ground. The man collapsed onto the concrete, his face pressed against the damp ground as Tyson pinned him down with ease. The police officers entered the alley, their weapons drawn as they took in the scene. "Hands where we can see them," one of them shouted, his voice cutting through the tension. "He's down," Tyson said, his tone calm but commanding. He released the masked man's arm, stepping back with his hands raised as the officers moved in to cuff him. The man didn't resist, his body limp with defeat as the cold metal of the handcuffs snapped around his wrists. The child let out a muffled sob, his small body trembling as the officers approached. One of them knelt down, his expression softening as he untied the ropes and removed the gag. "It's okay, kid," the officer said gently. "You're safe now." Tyson watched in silence, his chest heaving as the adrenaline began to fade. The masked man was hauled to his feet, his face pale and his eyes hollow as the officers led him toward the waiting police cars. The child clung to the officer who had freed him, his small hands clutching the man's uniform as he buried his face in his shoulder. Tyson's gaze lingered on the boy, his expression unreadable. The chaos had ended, but the weight of what had happened hung heavy in the air. The masked man's face twisted with rage as the officers grabbed his arms and began dragging him toward the waiting police cars. But just when it seemed like he had given up, his entire body tensed. With a feral scream, he wrenched one arm free, elbowing the nearest officer hard in the ribs. The officer stumbled back, gasping in pain, and the masked man seized the opportunity. Tyson's eyes locked on him instantly, and his body moved on instinct. "Get back!" Tyson shouted to the officers as the masked man lunged toward the child, who had just been freed from the ropes. The boy screamed, his tiny body scrambling to move behind the officer who had untied him. The officer turned, his hand reaching for his weapon, but the masked man was already too close. Before anyone could react, the masked man grabbed a broken shard of glass from the ground, the jagged edge catching the dim light. His hand trembled, but the fire in his eyes made it clear that he wasn't done fighting. "Nobody move!" he shouted, his voice wild and desperate. He held the shard out in front of him like a makeshift weapon, his movements erratic as he swung it toward anyone who dared come closer. The officers froze, their hands hovering near their holsters. One of them tried to reason with him, his voice calm but firm. "Drop the glass," he said, taking a cautious step forward. "This doesn't have to go any further." "It already has," the masked man screamed, his voice cracking. He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes darting toward the far end of the alley. "I'm not going to jail. I'll die before I let that happen." Tyson stepped forward, his broad shoulders blocking the officers from advancing. His presence alone seemed to draw all the attention in the alley, the tension thickening as he locked eyes with the masked man. "You've got nowhere to go," Tyson said, his voice low and steady. "You're just digging a deeper hole. Stay back," the masked man roared, his grip tightening on the shard of glass. His eyes darted to the child again, who was cowering behind the officer. "You won't touch him," Tyson interrupted, his voice cutting through the masked man's rant like a blade. "Not while I'm standing here." The masked man hesitated, his breathing ragged as he tried to process the situation. The officers were closing in again, their movements slow and deliberate, but Tyson waved them off. "Let me handle this," he said over his shoulder, his tone leaving no room for argument. The officers exchanged glances but held their positions, their hands still hovering near their weapons. The masked man laughed bitterly, his voice shaky. "You think you're in control here?" he spat. "You think you can talk me down? You're just a washed-up fighter trying to play hero." Tyson tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "I'm not trying to play anything," he said. "I'm just here to stop you from making the biggest mistake of your life." The masked man sneered, but his bravado was crumbling. His hands were shaking now, the shard of glass trembling in his grip. He glanced around the alley, his gaze darting to the edges of the crowd that had gathered near the police cars. People were watching now, phones out, recording everything. "Let them see you," Tyson said, gesturing toward the onlookers. "Let them see who you really are. Is this what you want to be remembered for? Threatening a kid with a piece of glass in a dirty alley?" The masked man froze, his chest heaving as Tyson's words hit him like a gut punch. His grip on the shard loosened slightly, but his eyes remained wild. "I didn't want this," he shouted, his voice breaking. "I didn't want any of this." "Then stop," Tyson said firmly, taking a slow step closer. "It's not too late to stop." But the masked man shook his head violently, his panic taking over again. "You don't get it," he muttered, his voice trembling. "You don't know what it's like to be nothing, to be invisible." "You're not invisible," Tyson said, his voice softening slightly. "I see you. Everyone here sees you. But this isn't the way to make them listen." The masked man's hands trembled, his grip on the shard loosening further. The officers exchanged glances, their fingers twitching near their weapons as they waited for the right moment to act. But then, out of nowhere, a loud crash echoed through the alley. One of the garbage bins near the entrance tipped over, spilling its contents onto the ground. The noise startled everyone, and the masked man flinched, his hand jerking involuntarily. That was all Tyson needed. In one swift, fluid motion, he closed the remaining distance between them, his hand shooting out to grab the masked man's wrist. The shard of glass fell from his hand, clattering to the ground as Tyson twisted his arm behind his back. The masked man let out a cry of pain, his knees buckling as Tyson forced him to the ground. "It's over," Tyson said, his voice low but firm. He pinned the man down with ease, his strength overwhelming any resistance the masked man tried to muster. The officers moved in quickly, snapping the cuffs onto the masked man's wrists before hauling him to his feet. This time, he didn't fight back. His shoulders slumped, his face pale and drenched in sweat as the reality of his defeat settled in. The crowd near the police cars erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the alley. Phones flashed as people recorded the moment, their voices a mix of awe and admiration as they called Tyson's name. But Tyson didn't acknowledge them. His focus was on the child, who was still trembling in the officer's arms. He approached slowly, his expression softening as he crouched down to the boy's level. "You're safe now," Tyson said gently, his voice a stark contrast to the authority he displayed moments earlier. "No one's going to hurt you." The boy looked up at him, his wide eyes filled with tears. Slowly, hesitantly, he reached out, his small hand clutching Tyson's shirt as he buried his face in the former boxer's chest. Tyson's jaw tightened, his arms wrapping protectively around the child. The chaos of the alley seemed to fade away, leaving only the sound of the boy's muffled sobs as the weight of what had just happened began to sink in. The applause and cheering from the crowd had barely begun to fade when the masked man, despite the cuffs biting into his wrists, made one last desperate attempt to resist. His eyes burned with fury and humiliation, the sound of the crowd mocking him in his mind. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, he twisted violently in the officer's grip, managing to free himself just enough to grab a loose piece of the broken glass from the ground. It happened in an instant. The masked man turned sharply, the jagged shard in his cuffed hands, and lashed out toward one of the officers holding him. The officer stumbled back with a cry, a thin red line appearing across his forearm where the glass had nicked him. The sight of blood sent a shockwave through the already tense scene. "Enough!" Tyson roared, his voice reverberating through the alley like thunder. He moved faster than anyone could react, his powerful frame a blur as he closed the distance between himself and the masked man. Tyson's hand shot out, grabbing the man's wrist with an iron grip and twisting just enough to force him to drop the shard. The glass hit the ground with a sharp clink, and the masked man let out a pained grunt, his body buckling under Tyson's strength. "You just don't know when to quit," Tyson growled, his voice low and dangerous. He released the man's wrist and shoved him back into the waiting arms of the officers, who wasted no time pinning him against the alley wall and securing him more tightly. The injured officer stepped back, cradling his arm as blood seeped through the tear in his sleeve. Another officer quickly moved to his side, pulling out a first aid kit from his belt. "It's just a scratch," the injured officer muttered, though his face was pale and his jaw was clenched with pain. Tyson turned to the officers, his expression a mix of frustration and concern. "You okay?" he asked the injured man, his voice softening slightly. The officer nodded, forcing a tight smile. "I'll live," he said, "but that guy needs to be locked up before he tries anything else." The masked man, now securely restrained, glared at Tyson with a mix of hatred and defeat. "You think you've won?" he spat, his voice hoarse. "You think this makes you a hero?" Tyson didn't even flinch. He took a step closer, his towering presence casting a long shadow over the man. "A hero?" Tyson said, his voice steady and cold. "I'm just a guy doing what needs to be done. You're the one who turned this into a circus." The man's sneer faltered, his bravado crumbling under Tyson's unrelenting gaze. The officers hauled him toward the police cars, their grip firm and unyielding. This time he didn't resist. His shoulders slumped, and his head hung low as the adrenaline drained from his body, leaving only exhaustion and the cold realization of what lay ahead. As the officers loaded the masked man into the back of a police car, Tyson turned his attention back to the child. The boy was still clinging to him, his small hands clutching Tyson's shirt like a lifeline. His sobs had quieted, but his body trembled with the aftershocks of fear and adrenaline. "You're okay now," Tyson said softly, crouching down to the boy's level. He gently placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, his touch firm but comforting. "No one's going to hurt you. Promise?" The boy looked up at him, his tear-streaked face filled with a mixture of fear and gratitude. Slowly, he nodded, his small hands relaxing their grip on Tyson's shirt. One of the officers approached, his voice quiet and respectful. "Mr. Tyson, we can take him now," he said, gesturing toward the child. "We'll make sure he gets checked out and reunited with his family." Tyson hesitated for a moment, his protective instincts warring with the knowledge that the boy needed more than he could give in this moment. Finally, he nodded, gently guiding the boy toward the officer. "You're in good hands," he said softly. "They'll take care of you." The boy clung to Tyson for another moment before finally letting go. The officer knelt down and spoke to the child in a soothing tone, guiding him toward the safety of another police car. Tyson watched them go, his jaw tightening as he took a deep breath. The crowd, still lingering at the edges of the alley, erupted into cheers again. "Mike Tyson! Mike Tyson!" they chanted, their voices a mixture of awe and excitement. Phones flashed as people recorded the aftermath, their videos already making their way to social media. Tyson turned toward the crowd, his expression unreadable. He raised a hand briefly in acknowledgement, but his focus remained on the boy, who was now safely inside the police car. The sight of the child, no longer bound but still visibly shaken, weighed heavily on him. As the police cars began to pull away, the injured officer approached Tyson again, his arm now bandaged. "Thanks for stepping in back there," the officer said, his tone genuine. "You probably saved a lot of lives tonight." Tyson nodded, his gaze still fixed on the retreating cars. "Just doing what anyone should have done," he said quietly. The officer chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "Not everyone would have done what you did," he said. "Most people would have run the other way." Tyson didn't respond immediately. He glanced at the crowd, their cheers and chants filling the alley, before turning back to the officer. "Sometimes running isn't an option," he said finally. "Not when there's something worth fighting for." The officer nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Well, whatever the reason, I'm glad you were here tonight." Tyson gave a faint smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. His mind was already elsewhere, replaying the events of the night and the choices that had led to this moment. The masked man's words, his desperation and anger, lingered in Tyson's thoughts like an unwelcome echo. As the last police car disappeared into the night, Tyson turned toward the alley's exit. The crowd parted for him, their cheers growing louder as he walked past. But Tyson didn't stop to bask in their admiration. His focus was on the boy, on the lessons he hoped the child would never have to learn firsthand. The masked man sat slumped in the back of the police car, his wrists cuffed tightly behind him and his face pale under the harsh glare of the interior light. His earlier defiance had completely drained away, leaving only exhaustion and a simmering rage that now had no outlet. He avoided the eyes of the officers sitting in the front seat, their hushed voices crackling through the radio as they coordinated with dispatch. The police car moved steadily through the city streets, its lights flashing silently as onlookers paused to watch. He glanced out the window, his jaw tightening as he caught a glimpse of a growing crowd gathered on the sidewalk near the scene. They were taking photos, pointing, some of them still chanting Tyson's name. The humiliation was almost unbearable. Just hours ago, he had convinced himself he was in control, that this plan would finally make people notice him. And now, he was nothing more than a defeated criminal being paraded in front of the world like a trophy. Back at the alley, the cleanup was in full swing. Officers cordoned off the area with yellow tape, directing the remaining crowd to disperse as forensic teams arrived to document the scene. The broken glass, the frayed ropes, the dark stains on the concrete. Every detail was being cataloged, a stark record of the violence that had unfolded. Tyson remained at the center of it all, his broad shoulders squared and his expression calm but stern. The crowd had thinned, but a few persistent onlookers still lingered, snapping photos and shouting words of admiration. Tyson didn't acknowledge them. His focus was elsewhere, his sharp eyes scanning the scene to ensure everything was being handled properly. One of the senior officers approached him, a clipboard in hand and a respectful but wary expression on his face. "Mr. Tyson," he said, his tone formal, "we've got the suspect in custody, and the boy is on his way to the hospital to be checked out. I just wanted to say, on behalf of the department, thank you for what you did tonight." Tyson nodded, his expression unreadable. "I just did what anyone should have done," he said simply. His gaze flicked toward the police car that had just pulled away, carrying the masked man toward the station. "What happens to him now?" The officer hesitated, glancing down at his clipboard. "He'll be booked and processed," he said. "Given the circumstances, assaulting an officer, resisting arrest, endangering a child, he's looking at some serious charges. It's likely he'll be held without bail." Tyson's jaw tightened slightly, but he gave no other outward reaction. "And the kid?" he asked. "He'll be fine," the officer said, shaken up, but physically unharmed. "We'll contact his family and make sure he gets the support he needs." Tyson nodded again, but his mind was still racing. He thought of the boy's wide, tear-filled eyes, the way he'd clung to Tyson like a lifeline. That kind of fear didn't just go away. It lingered, shaping how you saw the world. Tyson knew that better than most. As the officer walked away, Tyson took a deep breath, his shoulders rising and falling as he tried to shake off the tension still coiled in his muscles. The night wasn't over yet. Not for him, at least. There were still questions to be answered, statements to be given, and most importantly, a boy who needed reassurance that the world wasn't as cruel as it had seemed tonight. At the station, the masked man's bravado began to crumble further. The fluorescent lights of the booking room were harsh and unforgiving, illuminating every bead of sweat on his forehead, every twitch of his clenched jaw. The officers processed him methodically, their movements efficient and detached. His mugshot was taken, his belongings cataloged, and his fingerprints scanned. Each step felt like another nail in the coffin of his freedom. The lead officer overseeing the process didn't mince words as he read the list of charges aloud. Assault with a deadly weapon, kidnapping, endangering the welfare of a child, resisting arrest, assaulting an officer. The list went on, each charge landing like a hammer blow. By the time the officer finished, the masked man's shoulders had slumped, and his defiance had all but disappeared. "You're looking at a long time behind bars," the officer said bluntly, his tone devoid of sympathy. "And that's if the DA doesn't push for additional charges." The masked man said nothing. His mind raced with 100 excuses, justifications, and regrets, but none of them would change what was happening now. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. Meanwhile, Tyson sat in a quiet corner of the hospital waiting room, his large frame dwarfed by the too small chair. The boy was just a few rooms away, being examined by a pediatrician while a social worker spoke to his family. Tyson hadn't wanted to intrude, but he couldn't bring himself to leave yet. The boy had been through too much, and Tyson felt a responsibility to see this through. A nurse approached him cautiously, holding a steaming cup of coffee. "Here," she said softly, handing it to him. "You look like you could use this." Tyson accepted the cup with a small nod of thanks, his fingers wrapping around the warm ceramic. He took a sip, his gaze distant as he replayed the events of the night in his mind. The boy's cries, the masked man's wild eyes, the flash of the knife. It all lingered, refusing to fade. The nurse hesitated, then sat down in the chair next to him. "You did a good thing tonight," she said, her tone gentle. "That boy. He's lucky you were there." "Lucky?" Tyson echoed, his voice quiet but heavy. He shook his head slightly. "No kid should need luck to be safe." The nurse didn't respond immediately. She studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "You care a lot," she said finally. "More than most people would." Tyson didn't answer. He took another sip of coffee, his thoughts too tangled to put into words. Caring wasn't a choice for him, it was just who he was. As dawn broke over the city, the news of the night's events began to spread like wildfire. Videos of the confrontation flooded social media. Hashtags like #MikeTysonHero and #AlleyRescue trending within hours. The footage showed every detail. The masked man's wild swings, Tyson's calm deflections, the moment the child was freed. Comment sections buzzed with admiration and disbelief. The world once again captivated by the man who had once dominated the boxing ring. But Tyson didn't care about the headlines. He wasn't interested in being a hero or basking in the spotlight. For him, the night wasn't about recognition. It was about doing the right thing when no one else would. By mid-morning, Tyson finally left the hospital. The boy was safe with his family now, and the social workers assured Tyson that he would receive the support he needed to recover. As Tyson stepped outside, the crisp morning air hit his face, carrying with it a sense of finality. The alley, the chaos, the fear, it was behind him now, but the lessons it carried would stay with him. As he walked to his car, a reporter rushed up to him, microphone in hand and a cameraman trailing close behind. "Mr. Tyson," she called out, her voice breathless. "Can you tell us what was going through your mind last night? What made you step in?" Tyson paused, his hand on the car door. He turned to face the reporter, his expression calm but firm. "What made me step in?" he repeated. "That kid. That's all there is to it." The reporter pressed on. "Do you have anything to say to the man who was arrested? Or to the people who see you as a hero after what you did?" Tyson's jaw tightened slightly, and he took a deep breath. "To the man who did this, I hope he gets the help he needs, but that doesn't excuse what he did. And to the people calling me a hero, I'm just a guy who couldn't stand by and do nothing. That's all." With that, he got into his car and drove away, leaving the reporter and her cameraman standing on the curb. The city would move on, as it always did, but Tyson's actions would remain a reminder of what it meant to stand up in the face of injustice.